She was crying when he walked in, which was the one thing she had sworn she would not do. Not silently either, the kind of crying that gets into the shoulders, that makes the whole upper body helpless with it, that a woman does when she has held everything together so long and so hard that the muscles finally give out all at once. She had her back to the door. She was standing at the table in the kitchen of the Copper Falls boarding house, and on the table in front of her was a pan of bread she had just pulled from the oven. 12 perfect loaves, browning evenly, the smell of them filling every corner of the room. And she was weeping over them, the way a person weeps when they have just made the only thing they know how to make, and it is suddenly not enough. Silas Crane said nothing. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and the cold came in with him, and he did not move. Before this story goes any further, if you've ever stood in a kitchen and wondered whether what you had to give was enough, subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. Because what this woman says next, and what this rancher answers in front of the entire town of Copper Falls, Kansas, it will stay with you a long time after the screen goes dark. Her name was Hannah Elke, and she had been making bread since she was 9 years old. She had learned at her mother's table in a soddy outside of Abilene, where bread was not a courtesy but a calculation. How many loaves? How far would they stretch? What could be added to the flour to make it go further? She had learned that bread, done right, was not simple. It required the right hands, the right patience, and a quality her mother called listening. The ability to hear what the dough was asking for before it told you outright. By 30, she had spent a decade cooking in a hotel in Salina, Kansas, earning steady wages and saving most of them. And she had married a quiet carpenter named Frederick Elka, who died of a chest infection in the winter of 1884, leaving her with $200 in savings, a small debt on a boarding house she had bought the year before, and no children. She was 33 years old and full-figured, broad through the shoulders, substantial in the way that women who have done real physical work their whole lives are substantial. She had dark hair going gray at the temples and hands that showed every year of use, and did not apologize for any of them. She ran the Copper Falls boarding house alone. 3 meals a day for 12 boarders, the rooms, the accounts, and whatever repairs she could manage before paying someone to handle the rest. The trouble had begun in October, when the flour merchant in Copper Falls sold his business to his nephew. The nephew's name was Doyle, and Doyle had looked Hannah over the first time she came to place her monthly order with the same slow measuring look she had known her entire life, and told her the commercial rate no longer applied to single proprietors of her establishment size. Nearly double. The flat pleasantness of a man who expected no argument. She had paid, walked out, and stood in the street calculating. At the new rate, the boarding house would not sustain her past February. The stagecoach driver who brought the November supplies was a weathered woman named Birdie, who had been running that route for 11 years and knew every piece of news in the county before the newspaper printed it. "Lost his wife 2 years past," Birdie said, handing down crates without slowing her account. "Influenza. Left him with a boy, Samuel, 8 years old, quiet as a post. Crane runs 400 acres north of the creek, good land, well watered. He's been eating whatever the ranch hands put together since Elena passed. Salt beef and cornmeal, nothing else. Put an inquiry in at the county office. Cook and housekeeper, lives in, fair wages." She handed down the last crate and looked at Hannah steadily. "I told him about you." "He's a decent man," Birdie added. "Pays what he owes, keeps his word. You'd be trading a sinking ship for solid ground." That evening, Hannah sat at her kitchen table with the account books open and the November wind working at the window frames, and looked at the numbers until there was nothing left to see in them. Then she closed the books, put on her coat, and walked to the county office to inquire about Silas Crane's position. He came to the boarding house to meet her on a Thursday afternoon in late November, which was how she came to be standing at her own kitchen table with 12 loaves of bread and a decision she did not know how to make. She had known he was coming. She had baked the bread because she baked bread every Thursday regardless, and because she did not know what else to do with her hands when she was nervous. She had not expected to be crying when he arrived. She had expected to be composed and practical and to present herself as a skilled housekeeper with a sound reputation and 17 years of professional kitchen experience, which was all true and all relevant and none of which required tears. What had undone her was the account books. She had been reviewing them one final time before his arrival, looking perhaps for a number she had missed. Some calculation that would resolve everything without requiring her to change anything. And there was no such number. The boarding house would close, it was simply true. And she was 33 years old and full-figured and going gray at the temples, and she was going to walk into a stranger's house and cook his meals, and that was what her life had come to. She was not ashamed of it. She had never been ashamed of work. What had opened up under her, standing at that table, was something more specific and harder to name. The particular grief of a woman who has built something and watched it fail through no fault of her engineering, only the slow grinding of circumstances that did not care what she deserved. She heard the door. She heard him knock. She did not turn around. "Come in," she said, and her voice was steadier than the rest of her. He came in and stopped. She knew he was there. She did not yet have her face in order. The bread was in front of her, and the crying was still in her shoulders, and she said, to the bread, to the room, to the difficulty of the whole situation, "I am sorry. I will be... just a moment." Silas Crane waited. He was a patient man by nature and a patient man by training, because ranching in Kansas required a patience that most people could not sustain. The patience for weather, for animals, for the long, neutral silence between planting and harvest. He waited the way a man waits when he understands that the waiting is itself a form of courtesy. When she turned around, her eyes were red and her back was straight. "Hannah Elke," she said, "I expect you are Silas Crane." "I am," he said. He was a tall man, lean rather than spare, with the sun-darkened skin and particular squint of a man who spent most of his days outdoors and not enough of them under a hat. He had gray at his temples too, she noticed. His hands were large and rough-knuckled, and he held his hat with both of them with the careful dignity of a man in a formal situation. "I know what you came to discuss," she said, "and I will be plain with you, because I think plain is better than polished when it comes to arrangements like this." "I'd be grateful for plain," he said. She looked at the bread, then at him. She had been running the boarding house for 3 years, and she had learned that there were 2 kinds of negotiations. The kind where you held something back to see what the other person offered first, and the kind where laying everything on the table at once was the only move that made any sense. This was the second kind. "I am a good cook," she said. "The best in Copper Falls. I will say it plainly because it is true, and modesty serves neither of us. I am clean and organized, and I work from before dawn until the work is finished. I am 33 years old, and I was married 7 years, and I know how to run a house." She paused. "I also know that men who advertise for a housekeeper are sometimes advertising for something else. I am not that. I am a cook and a housekeeper, and that is all I am offering." "That is all I am looking for," Silas said. She nodded. She had believed him before he answered, but it was necessary to say it. She looked back at the bread again, all 12 loaves, which she had made this morning the way she made bread every morning, the way her hands made it almost without her asking them to. And something came loose in her chest that she had been holding there without knowing it. "I cannot give you beauty," she said. And her voice went rough on the last word, and the crying came back into it before she could stop it. "I know what you are used to. I know what you had." She had heard enough about Elena Crane in 4 days to know that Silas's wife had been a slender woman, fine-boned, from a family in Missouri with money and education and refinement. "I cannot give you that. I can give you bread. I can give you a house that runs and a boy who is fed and—" She stopped because the crying had gotten into her throat and was making it difficult. "And steady hands and a clean kitchen and whatever else the work requires. That is what I have. It is all I have." She had not meant to say it. She had not meant to say any of it. The dining room of the Copper Falls boarding house was not a private space. There were 3 boarders at their tables not 20 feet away, and the door between the kitchen and the dining room was open. And she had not known it was open. And she had been crying over 12 loaves of bread, and every word she had just said had traveled clearly through that open door to the men on the other side of it. She knew it the moment she stopped speaking. The silence from the dining room was the specific silence of people who have just heard something they were not meant to hear and have not yet decided what to do about it. Silas Crane looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the bread. He looked back at her. Then he said something. He said it quietly, but the door was open, and the dining room was silent, and it carried. He had not planned to speak. He was not a man who planned speeches. He was a man who said what was true when the truth seemed necessary and otherwise kept his own counsel. What he said rose up from somewhere he had not examined in 2 years, since the morning he had come in from the north pasture to find Elena gone, and the house changed in its bones. "My wife," he said, "was beautiful." He said it simply, the way a man states a fact about weather or acreage. "I loved her very much, and I was proud of her, and she is gone, and I will not pretend otherwise." He paused. But beauty never kept a fire going. It never set a table or kept a boy from crying himself to sleep. It never came down at 3 in the morning when Samuel had a fever and stayed until morning. He looked at the bread, at all 12 loaves of it, brown and steady, and made by a woman who had been making bread since she was 9 years old. "What you are offering me," he said, "is worth more than you know. And I would be a fool to stand here and tell you it isn't enough. Because it is more than enough, and any man who told you different lied to you." He said it to her, but the door was open, and the 3 boarders in the dining room heard every word, and one of them was Doyle, the flour merchant's nephew, who had been taking his Thursday supper at the boarding house for 6 weeks, and who had charged Hannah double the commercial rate, and who sat very still with his fork suspended over his plate and said nothing at all. Word travels fast in a town of 400 people. By Friday morning, it had traveled to the dry goods store, the post office, the livery, and the church porch. Carried by the boarders who had been present, and by the waitress who had been at the kitchen door, and by the natural velocity of a story that contained something true. By Friday afternoon, it had reached the county land office, where a clerk named Howell mentioned it to the territorial assessor, who had been looking at Doyle's pricing practices for other reasons entirely. By Saturday, Doyle had received a formal inquiry regarding his rate-setting procedures. Hannah did not know any of this until Monday. She was busy. She had given her notice on the boarding house, settled the accounts, packed what she owned into 2 trunks, and ridden north with Bertie to the Crane property, which sat on a long rise above the creek with the winter wheat coming in. thin in the east field, and the house square and solid and cold in the way that houses go cold when there is no woman in them. Samuel Crane met her at the wagon. He was 8 years old, dark-eyed, cautious in the way that children are cautious when they have been disappointed enough times that caution has become a habit. He looked at her trunks. He looked at her. "Are you going to stay?" he said. The last one didn't stay. "I am going to stay," Hannah said. He considered this. "Can you make biscuits?" "I can make 12 kinds of biscuit," she said. "Which kind do you want first?" He was quiet for a moment. "The kind with the crisp bottom," he said. "Then that is what you will have for supper." He picked up the smaller of her 2 trunks without being asked. It was nearly as big as he was, and he staggered under it. But he did not put it down and carried it toward the house. She watched him go. Then she picked up the larger trunk and followed. The kitchen was exactly what she had expected. Cold, under-provisioned, the stove in need of a thorough cleaning, the flour barrel running low. The window above the basin looked out over the creek and the bare cottonwood along its banks. And the morning light came through it at an angle that would be, in a different season, very fine. She put on her apron and began. In the weeks that followed, the house changed the way houses change when a capable woman decides they are going to. The stove was cleaned and stayed clean. The flour barrel was full. The meals came at regular hours and were hot and sufficient, and occasionally something more. A molasses pie on a Sunday. A pot of stewed tomatoes from the cellar that filled the kitchen with a smell like summer. A batch of the crisp-bottomed biscuits Samuel had requested and taken to appearing in the kitchen doorway every afternoon to watch being made. Silas came in for those biscuits the second week. He had been in from the east field early for wire and passed through the kitchen, and the smell stopped him. Samuel was at the table. Hannah was at the stove. 5 minutes, she said, without turning around. He stayed. He ate 2 biscuits standing at the counter and said nothing about them, but he remained slightly longer than necessary, and when he finally went out, his step had a different quality. Not lighter exactly, but less weighted. Samuel noticed. Children always do. On the 14th day, Hannah found a fresh bundle of sage tied to the back door handle. She brought it inside and hung it near the stove. And that evening, the kitchen smelled of sage and warm bread and wood smoke. On the 21st day, the loose step on the back porch, the one she had been stepping around carefully for 3 weeks, had been repaired. New board, clean nails. She had not mentioned it to him. She did not mention it now. The midpoint trouble arrived in the form of a letter, as trouble in that country so often did. It came with the postal carrier on a Wednesday in early January, addressed to Silas in a formal hand from a law office in Wichita. She left it on the table and did not read it. When he came in that evening, he picked it up, read it, set it down with a flatness in the motion that told her what she needed to know before he said anything. "My wife's family," he said. "Her brother. He is contesting the land title. He says Elena's portion of the original purchase was contributed through her family's money and reverts to them on her death. 'Cause," he looked at the letter. "It is not true. The money was jointly held. But he has a lawyer in Wichita, and the hearing is in 6 weeks. He looked up at her. "I may not be able to pay you for the next 2 months. She looked at him steadily. "I did not come here for 2 months, she said. He looked at her for a long moment, the way he sometimes looked at things, the fence line, the weather coming over the ridge, when he was making a calculation that mattered. "I know," he said. "I wanted to say it anyway." The hearing was held in the Copper Falls County Courthouse on the 3rd Friday of February, before a circuit judge named Alderman who came down from Wichita once a month and was known to be thorough and impatient with theater. Elena's brother, a pale man named Garrett, with an attorney who charged by the word, presented his case with the confidence of a man who believed the facts were on his side and the law was on his side, and that the outcome was therefore inevitable. Silas presented his case with a deed, a joint bank record from the Salina National Bank dated March of 1878, and a letter in Elena's own hand to her brother, explaining that the ranch money was hers and Silas's together, and belonged to neither family separately. He had found the letter in her writing box the previous week. He had not known it existed. Garrett's attorney attempted to argue that Elena had been under duress when she wrote the letter. Judge Alderman looked at the attorney for a long moment over his spectacles. "In your professional assessment," he said, "was she also under duress when she signed the joint deed? And the joint bank record? And the marriage certificate?" He did not wait for an answer. "Case is dismissed." The courtroom was not large. It held perhaps 40 people, ranchers and townspeople and a few of the county officials who made a habit of attending circuit hearings, and the flour merchant's nephew Doyle, who had come for reasons of his own, and Bertie the stagecoach driver, who had come because she came to everything, and Samuel Crane, who had come because his father had said he could, and who was sitting in the front row, with his hands folded in his lap, with the particular solemnity of a boy who understood that something important was happening. Hannah was there too, in the second row, in her good wool dress, with her dark hair pinned back and her hands in her lap, watching Silas receive the judgment the way a person watches something they have hoped for, without letting themselves believe in it. When it was done, Silas came out of the courthouse into the February cold and stood on the steps, and the town of Copper Falls arranged itself around him in the loose, natural way of people who are waiting to see what happens next. Garrett was already retreating toward his hired buggy. His attorney was putting papers in his case. Doyle was standing near the edge of the crowd. He had been standing near the edges of things for 2 months, since the territorial assessor's inquiry had resulted in a formal adjustment of his rate-setting practices and a modest restitution to the commercial accounts he had overcharged. He had not spoken to Hannah directly since. He looked at her now, and then looked away. Bertie appeared at Hannah's elbow. "Well," she said quietly, "that's done." It was done. Hannah stood in the cold with the courthouse at her back and the winter sun very bright and thin on the frozen street, and she thought about 12 loaves of bread on a table in November, and a man in a doorway, and words she had not meant to say in a voice that had gone rough with the truth of them, and she thought about what had come after: the sage on the door handle, the repaired step, the biscuits eaten standing at a counter by a man who had not commented on them and had not needed to. Silas came down the courthouse steps. He walked past the people near the door, past the cluster of ranchers congratulating him, past Bertie, and stopped in front of Hannah. He looked at her the way he sometimes looked at the fence line and the weather, with the full, patient attention of a man who was finished calculating and had arrived at his answer. "I would like to make this a permanent arrangement," he said. "I am asking you to marry me. I know what you are and what you have, and I am telling you it is more than enough. It has always been more than enough." He had said it plainly, in front of 40 people, the way he said everything, not performing it, not constructing it, just stating what was true. Samuel, in the front of the crowd, was watching his father with an expression that was trying very hard to be composed and was not entirely succeeding. Hannah looked at Silas for a long moment. The February wind moved through the street, and the bare cottonwood along the creek rattled their branches, and somewhere a horse shifted against a hitching post. "Yes," she said. They were married in April, when the winter wheat was a full inch out of the ground, and the creek was running high with snowmelt, and the cottonwood along its banks had gone into that particular yellow-green of the very earliest spring. Bertie drove the wedding party to the church. Samuel sat between his father and Hannah for the ceremony, with his shoulders squared and his hands in his lap. And when the circuit preacher pronounced them married, he let out a breath so long and so deliberate that the woman in the pew behind him put her hand over her mouth. Doyle sold his flower business and left Copper Falls before summer. The Territorial Assessor's review concluded in June and found that 3 other commercial accounts in the county had been overcharged. The matter was resolved without drama, as most things are when the records are thorough and the facts are plain. On the morning of their first wedding anniversary, Hannah baked 12 loaves of bread at dawn, the same number she had baked that Thursday in November, the same recipe, the same hands. She set them on the kitchen table and looked at them in the early light, at all that warmth and weight and usefulness, and felt nothing like grief. Samuel came down at 6 in the morning and stood in the kitchen doorway, the way he had been standing in that doorway since October, and looked at the bread. "Is it a special occasion?" he said. "It is a Tuesday," Hannah said. He came and sat at the table. She put a plate in front of him. Outside the kitchen window, the spring light was coming over the ridge, and the creek was visible through the new cottonwood leaves, bright and running fast, and the east field was green all the way to the fence line, a green so full and even that it looked like it had always been that way, like no winter had ever touched it, like it had simply been waiting all along for the right season. She had learned a long time ago that what a woman put into bread, the patience, the listening, the hours of her hands, did not diminish by being given away. It multiplied. That was the nature of it. That was what her mother had known and tried to tell her. Back in a soddy in Abilene, with the wind coming across the flat land and the smell of bread filling every corner of a small and insufficient room and making it, for that hour, enough. She understood it now. She had always understood it. She had only needed someone willing to receive it.